Hi everyone. So it's a bit tricky to be the last session, the last part of the session. Everybody's hungry, including myself. So hopefully it's a fun session and quick one. And I hope there'll be some time for questions in the end. In this presentation, it's very okay. In this presentation, I'll be talking about open access. Which problems are we trying to address in the Qatar National Library? What are we doing right now? And what is still needed in the future? So a colleague of mine asked me, why are you talking about open access in an interlibrary loan document supply conference? And to answer that, I actually have a question. What if libraries can have access to all research content in the world? And if we look at research content as an iceberg, we might actually just have, this is not working? Okay, the tip of the iceberg, right? And so the question is, what if we can have it all? And what if this access is immediate and instant? So, like this picture. Right. It's not working. So, if it's instant and immediate as this. Now, I don't really like the Polaroid formula. It takes about 20 minutes to develop, which is basically the time I have to stop talking. So as soon as it develops, I'll just stop. So, but the question is, what if it's immediate and what if it's instant? To answer this question, we need to look at the context where we are in time and in physical space and geography. So in time, there's an effect of how technology affected the information landscape. So there's a transformation, of course, from print to digital, which you've heard about today and we'll continue hearing about in this conference. But libraries now need licenses for electronic licenses or electronic resources. And copyright isn't equal in all countries. So national laws might limit reproductions or transmission of copyrighted works from, like I say, cross-border. And the licenses themselves, as we heard today, might be limiting. We also live in a time where we have to meet user needs. This is a picture I took in September 2020. It was during the first lockdown during COVID. I came to the library to pick up my laptop because we were all working from home. But the library was quiet and it was dark and it's not what we see today, right? And hopefully we don't go back to that. But what was evident was that electronic resources are very important, because people couldn't come to the library without an appointment. There were less people, so we need to give them more electronic resources. And of course, as libraries around the world, we live in a time of uncertainty when it comes to, let's say, budget cuts or competition for resources. To give a bit of context about where we are, I'll be talking about the library and Qatar copyright law, and how it relates to maximizing research in Qatar. Okay. So our mission in Qatar National Library is to preserve the nation and region's heritage and enable the people of Qatar to positively influence society by creating an exceptional environment for learning and discovery. And we see that research or research content or research outcomes is an integral part of this legacy or heritage. And Qatar copyright law, it's a bit old. It's from 2002. And typically in this law, most works are protected by copyright for 50 years after the author's life. And we also have several exceptions. So for making preservation and replacement copies, serving persons with disabilities, and making copies for educational use and teaching. And as much as I hate to say, we don't have fair use in the law. Right? Many people ask, unfortunately we don't. Which brings me to the question, how can we maximize the use of Qatar's research outputs? And to answer this, we need to look at the potential issues that come from electronic resources. So let's imagine this is a publisher's collection, right? So we've got content behind a subscription wall. And if we want to have access to this, we would need to pay a subscription fee or a license fee. And we're happy, we get access to everything. From our perspective, of course, some of this research is published by Qatar-based researchers in Maroon here. And when we get a subscription, we also get access to this content. The problem, however, is when we don't have an active subscription, we either decide not to renew, or we don't actually have a subscription in the first place. We lose access. We actually lose access to all of Qatar's research that's coming in the future. I mean, we might have access to the previously published content through perpetual access, but it's not in every single agreement. So, and this is very tricky, right? So we see that being open science and open research and open access is a viable solution. Now, what I mean by open, and we've heard it today and in yesterday's workshops, open access means free to use, yes, but it's not only just free to use. The work, the licenses around open access allows the work to be modified, remixed, which also includes translations. And that's something that we need to translate also works from, let's say, English to Arabic to make it more accessible locally. And the licenses also means that the works can be shared with anybody for any purpose. Ruined the surprise. But so if you imagine again, this is the research that we want to have. Open access can be a solution. And it could basically compensate for all the information that we cannot get through, let's say, like licenses and electronic resources. Which brings me to the Qatar National Library Open Access Program. This is a program that was set up a couple of years ago. I think October 25th, 2015. It was announced at 12 p.m. in an Open Access Week conference. I remember this because it was my wife's birthday and I wasn't there. But the program, the goal of the program is to cover open access publishing costs for Qatar-based researchers, but also to create and contribute to the permanent archive of Qatar-based research at the library. And some might ask, why do we even have a fund? So researchers in Qatar, they want to publish open access. That's something that we've established through surveys, through focus groups, even through just talking with them on a daily basis. But the problem is that choosing to publish open access costs money. And there's a lack of institutional support in Qatar for open access. There are no mandates, there are no real policies to force researchers to publish open access, which is something I'll come back to a bit later. And there's also a lack of sufficient funding for open access from grant agencies. Yes, they do provide some money, but it's not enough to cover the publications during the grant. And of course, we're also dealing with publications that happen after the grant is over. This is where we come. And we see that open access is beneficial to the country for all these good reasons, right? It's an alignment with the Qatar National Vision 2030. It allows for visible and transparent return on publicly research-funded or funded research. It's essential in the development of a knowledge-based economy, and it's an enabling factor in interdisciplinary research. So over time, we've set up the service, and we've been supporting researchers. And to benefit from this, the author has to be affiliated with a Qatar-based institution. He or she must be the corresponding author. So we're also looking at a very a small group. It's not all authors. They have to be the corresponding author. And we also ask them if they've exhausted all other sources of funding. Because we're also working with a limited pool of funds, and it has to be somewhat fair. And we also, of course, have other criteria that the journal needs to be listed in the Directory of Open Access Journals. And again, of course, the author must be affiliated, or the corresponding author must be affiliated with a Qatar-based institution. So how does this look now? We've set up a couple of years ago. So this graph shows basically the development in the growth of the number of approved articles over time. Now, we started collecting data in 2018, and we had about 123. In 2021, we reached almost 1,000. And till September 15, 2022, we have 665 articles, and hopefully we reach that 1,000 this year. And over this time, we've supported almost 1,400 authors from 33 different institutions in Qatar. So it's quite evident that there's high demand for this. And I've shown you the approved requests, but because we also have rejected requests. And this is an issue that we'll be discussing later on. So there is high demand for open access. Researchers want it. And as a library, we need to figure out how to meet that demand. And the question is, how do we actually support the fund? So we do it through different means. The first one is through publishing agreements, and the second is through individual article payment. I'll be focusing today on the agreements, but just to mention that there are different ways. So we have agreements with fully open access publishers, such as Plus, Biomass Central, Dove. We also have agreements with, let's say, the traditional publishers, and which combines read access with publishing. This is the major source of funding for the Open Access Fund, but we also have, let's say, credit card payments or purchase order payments for articles that are not covered in these agreements. So how do read and publish agreements work? It kind of shifts the cost from access or reading access to publishing. So if we look at this kind of plot again, in a subscription, we have a mix of, in the read and publish agreements, basically the library gets a certain amount of articles that we can use to support researchers in Qatar. So if you look, there's a mix of paywall content, which is basically freed upon subscription. We also have a mix of Qatar-based research and open access research. And when we have an active agreement, we have access to everything here. But now when we have an inactive agreement, we still have access to the Qatar-based research. We don't lose access to it. Now, over time, what you expect is that other libraries around the world are adopting read and publish agreements. And in an active agreement, you have a higher mix of open access content compared to paywalled content. And when libraries stop paying, we actually have more open access. So this way, we're moving away from the dependency on license agreements. By publishing more open access, we can build a larger archive going forward. Now, we're not doing this alone, right? So we're doing this as a consortium here in Qatar, which consists of 10 different institutions from Qatar University, Hamad bin Khalifa University, and Sidra, and others. And how does this look like? Well, we negotiate as a consortium, and we use open principles when negotiating. The idea is that we want to support different business models. And at one point, we had 15 different agreements with publishers. We also, as a consortium, we're thinking about the sustainability of moving forward. It's not just about covering the fees now, but how can we make the service a sustainable service moving forward? So as I mentioned, we're trying to shift costs from a basic license, where we just get access to read and that's it, to more of publishing. And the goal here is twofold. One is to really support Qatar-based researchers, and the second is actually more of has a national impact. By having more open access content coming out from Qatar, we're actually increasing the global reach for research here. And of course, that helps the reputation moving forward. Now, as I mentioned, we had at one point 15 agreements. We have about now 12 or 13. Having the agreement is good, but having a really good agreement is even better. And that's why we talk about negotiating equitable terms. So it's not just enough signing an agreement. And I would say, as a library, if you get an agreement from publisher, never sign it like as soon as you get it, right? That's the worst thing you can get. And maybe that's what they want, but don't do it, right? And maybe we're not very popular with publishers sometimes, but we are looking what's best for Qatar National Library, what's best for the consortium, and what's best for the country. And we work under some guiding principles. I mentioned that the Qatar copyright law is 20 years old. In legal terms, that's a bit kind of out of date, right? One of the limitations in the Qatar copyright law, it doesn't include anything that says digital in it. There's no word, there's no digital, there's no digitization in the Qatar copyright law. And there are no, let's say, there's no text that addresses the needs of the library. So when we're negotiating an agreement with a publisher, we ensure that it addresses interlibrary loan. It allows for classroom use or course pack in both print and electronic format. We try to allow for repository deposits, and we also allow for text and data mining. We also want to clarify authorized users, including people coming in as walk-in users, patrons, staff, and students. And we also ensure, we put a statement in there that nothing in this agreement overrides exceptions in local law. And there are some really interesting exceptions. I didn't mention everything, but there is Article 21B, which one publisher said, there's no way I'm agreeing to this. And in this exception, it says that if a book or content is not produced in Arabic, in the Arabic language 3 years after its publication in English, then a license could be received from the Ministry of Culture or Economy to translate the book and publish it locally. Not many people know of this, and it hasn't been actually used in practice, except maybe for one case in Qatar University, where their business school books had to be translated from English to Arabic, and there were none in the market. So that's a very interesting exception. So we haven't done much of it, and I would love to see more publishers and universities doing this, but we ensure that nothing in the agreement overrides exceptions in local law. We also remove any language for non-disclosure or confidentiality. The idea there is that we're doing something advanced here. We haven't done in the last couple of years, something new. And we want other institutions to know what we're doing, specifically to know which terms we've agreed to in the agreements. Because we've reached this stage by learning from others. Many other countries, many other libraries and consortia publish their agreements online. We've actually gone and saw what other libraries have agreed to, and we've used this in our advantage, and we want others to actually benefit from this. We also want to be transparent about how much we're spending and the amount we're spending per publishers. So we're also part of the Open APC initiative, and this is a screenshot of what Qatar National Library have spent over the last couple of years. The idea here is not to say we've spent this money. It's basically to say we've spent this X money for this publisher, and we want to know what other libraries are doing. Because publishers might give you a different cost or different price to what other libraries will receive. So we want more transparency in the system. Now, we've done all of this. We've supported authors. We're working with guiding principles, but but we also have some challenges. And we have some local challenges and we have some global challenges which we can help with, but we can't, it's out of control maybe. Locally, we need open access policies and mandates. So far, the initiative to support open access has come from Qatar National Library and from the QNL consortium. But if we have a policy or mandate saying that any research published by public money should be open access, I think this will help us significantly moving forward. We also need updates to Qatar copyright law. Not only with open access, there are other things. For example, Marrakesh Treaty was mentioned today. We still need the Qatar copyright law to be updated to reflect this. Most importantly right now, as a practical solution, we need to improve cost-sharing models within the consortium. We need to make it fair. that the smaller institutions can still contribute, the bigger institutions contribute more, and we're still working with them closely. And I hope that in maybe a month, we will have a meeting with all the consortium members to discuss this specifically, a specific point. Now, what's really important is that key stakeholders need to have better engagement. This is a slide I have in every single presentation I give since 2012. Now, we have actually a very unique opportunity in Qatar, and maybe even in Qatar Foundation. So if you look at Qatar Foundation, and you'll probably see this in the tour today, we have universities, we have libraries, we have grant funding agencies, we have publishers. So why can't we all get together and come up with a solution to support open access? Maybe not on a national level, but maybe on a QF Qatar Foundation level. But engagement and talking with each other is very important. And this is a quote my colleague Milan loves. There is enough money in the system, right? So when we look at what we support in terms of funding, it's a lot. But when we say we cannot fund you, the paper is still published. And the money is still paid, somehow. So there are the APCs in the wild that we don't know about. But of course, some authors, unfortunately, have to pay from their own pocket. And that's something we want to avoid. But we know that some institutions, in case that we don't fund them, they can then come up with the money. The question is, how can we pool this money together to support a national open access fund? So there is enough money in the system. We just need to figure out how to get it. Some global challenges. So library funding, I mean, I'm not going to discuss that, but we all know that library funding worldwide is always going down. But what's really important is that I've talked about how we and Qatar National Library and the QNL Consortium have 15 different agreements, right? That's great. But these agreements are not provided to every consortium or libraries worldwide. Publishers are being selective to which libraries they're giving these agreements to. I think we're the first in the region to have many of these agreements, but read and publish agreements are not very common in the region. There are some in Saudi Arabia, there's a big one now in Egypt, but it's not very common. Another problem is that publishers have different terms for different libraries. There are many variances in licensing terms. And that's why I talked about the non-disclosure and the confidentiality. We want the system to be more transparent. And of course, we need more repositories for open content. Now, this is maybe a kind of infrastructure issue. It could be a policy issue. But having more repositories will definitely help. And we as Qatar National Library, again with the consortium, we're launching a national research repository very soon to address this very issue locally. Now, we need to work together, right? This is the prisoner's dilemma, right? Now, there's no jail here. There's no jail in libraries. But imagine that two libraries are working independently from each other. Both want a license, both want an agreement with the publisher, and they go and seek out this agreement independently. What could happen actually is that they don't get good terms. They actually might pay much more. So, but the thing is, when working together, they can actually achieve more equitable terms, better deals, and even savings, because individual libraries are paying less right now through a consortium than they would pay individually. And that's the best argument that we have in convincing local institutions in joining our consortium. Now, I've talked about open access. I've talked about how open access is great. I'll come back to the same question I've asked in the beginning. What if libraries and what if QNL can have access to all this research content? How will it look like? I mean, I would love for it to happen. We're in the right direction. We're much better than we were 5 years ago. But there's still a lot to achieve. Stakeholder engagement, policies, mandates, securing funds, better agreements, etc. So I really can't tell you how a library would look like if it had all the research content in the world. So what I tried to do is ask Midjourney, which is an AI entity, maybe I would call it an entity, and asked Midjourney, the AI, how would the library look like if it had all the research in the world? Oh, and this is something that the AI generated. So I think it's quite cool. Now this is, of course, in DALI surrealist style, but this is how a library would look like if it had. It's very similar to maybe we in Boston Spa. All right. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.